Sometimes a single dollar can change two lives forever. When you're a homeless street artist with nothing but a worn sketchbook and broken crayons, selling your drawings for spare change seems hopeless. Until you meet someone who sees more than just a desperate kid begging for coins. But what happens when that someone turns out to be one of the most powerful CEOs in the country, and your innocent artwork becomes the key to unlocking secrets that could destroy everything he's built? Before we dive into this incredible true story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this story touches your heart, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow I have something even more amazing to share with you. The morning fog rolled through downtown Seattle like a gray blanket, casting shadows across the bustling Pike Street where 12-year-old Mark Scott sat cross-legged on a piece of cardboard outside the gleaming North Point Financial Tower. His small hands, stained with charcoal and colored pencil residue, carefully arranged a collection of drawings in front of him. Portraits of strangers, cityscapes, and whimsical creatures that seemed to dance across the weathered paper despite being created with supplies salvaged from dumpsters and donated art programs. Mark had been living on the streets for 6 months now, ever since aging out of his last foster home with nowhere to go and no family to turn to. At only 12 years old, he was too young for most shelters and too old for the overwhelmed child services system that had already failed him repeatedly, bouncing between homes where he was either ignored, mistreated, or simply seen as another burden to bear until someone else could take responsibility. But Mark possessed something that no amount of institutional neglect could steal. An extraordinary artistic talent that transformed even the most mundane subjects into breathtaking works of art. "Please buy my drawing for $1, Mark called out to the steady stream of business professionals hurrying past his makeshift gallery. His voice carried a mixture of hope and resignation that seemed heartbreaking coming from someone so young, shaped by countless hours of being invisible to people who stepped around him as if he were just another piece of urban debris. Most passers-by avoided eye contact entirely, their expensive shoes clicking against the pavement in rhythms that spoke of important meetings and financial deadlines that left no room for acknowledging the humanity of a 12-year-old boy trying to survive through his art. Mark's current masterpiece was a detailed portrait of the city skyline at sunset, rendered in colored pencils he'd found in a school dumpster and carefully sharpened with a broken razor blade. The drawing captured not just the architectural beauty of Seattle's downtown core, but somehow conveyed the emotional landscape of a city where dreams and desperation coexisted within blocks of each other. Every line revealed Mark's keen observation skills and natural artistic instincts that had never received formal training but flourished despite his circumstances. The cardboard beneath him was damp from the previous night's rain, and Mark could feel the cold seeping through his thin jacket, an oversized hand-me-down from his last foster placement that provided little protection against Seattle's unpredictable weather. His stomach hadn't seen a proper meal in 2 days, just the leftover sandwich crusts he'd found behind a downtown deli and a cup of hot chocolate that a kind barista had given him when no one was looking. But Mark had learned to survive on hope and determination, channeling his hunger and loneliness into artistic expression that transformed his pain into something beautiful. The North Point Financial Tower loomed above him like a glass and steel monument to everything Mark had never experienced: security, stability, success. Through the building's massive windows, he could glimpse the movement of people in expensive suits conducting business that involved more money than Mark could imagine. Sometimes he would sketch the building's architectural details, fascinated by how the morning light created geometric patterns across its surface, turning corporate intimidation into artistic inspiration. Mark's art supplies consisted of a battered sketchbook with pages held together by duct tape, a handful of colored pencils in various stages of wear, a few pieces of charcoal wrapped in newspaper, and a pink eraser that had been reduced to a tiny stub through months of constant use. Every tool was precious, irreplaceable given his financial situation, and Mark treated them with the reverence that other teenagers might reserve for the latest video games or toys. His technique had been developed through pure experimentation and observation, watching art tutorials on library computers during the brief periods when he could access internet connectivity. The morning rush hour brought its usual parade of potential customers, though Mark had learned to read the body language that indicates who might actually stop versus who would pretend he didn't exist. Occasionally, someone would pause to examine his work, usually tourists who found his street art charming or college students who appreciated artistic talent even when they couldn't afford to purchase anything. Mark's prices were deliberately modest: $1 for small sketches, $3 for detailed portraits, $5 for his most elaborate cityscapes. He wasn't trying to get rich, he was simply trying to survive another day with enough money for food and the occasional art supply from the dollar store. What Mark didn't know was that his regular spot outside the North Point Financial Tower had placed him directly in the path of the building's most powerful occupant. David Davis, CEO of Davis Enterprises, arrived at his office at exactly 7:30 a.m., his routine as precisely calculated as the financial algorithms that had made him one of the youngest billionaires in the tech industry. At 36, David had built his empire through a combination of brilliant strategic thinking, ruthless business instincts, and an emotional detachment that allowed him to make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by sentiment or compassion. But today, something would happen that would challenge everything David thought he knew about success, humanity, and the true cost of building an empire on the foundation of other people's dreams. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. David Davis stepped out of his black Tesla Model S into the crisp Seattle morning, his Italian leather shoes meeting the polished concrete with the confident stride of a man who owned half the city's tech sector. His daily routine was methodical: arrive at 7:30 a.m. sharp, review overnight market reports during his elevator ride to the 47th floor, and begin his day with the ruthless efficiency that had built Davis Enterprises into a $12 billion empire before his 40th birthday. But today, something disrupted his carefully orchestrated morning ritual. "Please buy my drawing for $1, came a small voice from his left, barely audible above the rumble of downtown traffic and the clicking heels of other executives hurrying toward their corporate kingdoms. David's first instinct was to continue walking, as he had done countless times before when approached by Seattle's homeless population. His security team had briefed him on maintaining appropriate distance from street dwellers, liability issues, safety concerns, corporate image protection. In David's world, compassion was a luxury that shareholders couldn't afford, and every minute spent on non-productive activities was money lost in an increasingly competitive market. Yet, something made him pause. Perhaps it was the youth in the voice, or the polite phrasing that suggested education rather than the aggressive panhandling he'd grown accustomed to ignoring. David turned slightly and saw Mark Scott for the first time, a 12-year-old boy with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that hung loosely on his small frame, but with eyes that held an intensity and intelligence that seemed far older than his years. Spread before Mark on a piece of wet cardboard was an array of drawings that made David's breath catch in his throat. Even from several feet away, he could see the extraordinary detail and artistic sophistication that no 12-year-old should have been capable of without years of professional training. The cityscape drawing particularly drew his attention. It captured the North Point Financial Tower with architectural precision while somehow conveying the emotional weight of urban isolation and corporate ambition. "You drew these?" David asked, his voice carrying genuine surprise rather than the polite dismissal he typically offered to street encounters. Mark nodded eagerly, his face lighting up with the rare pleasure of adult attention that wasn't accompanied by suspicion or pity. "Yes, sir, I draw every day. This one took me 3 days to finish," he said, pointing to the cityscape with pride that transcended his obvious hunger and exhaustion. David knelt down to examine the artwork more closely, his expensive suit momentarily forgotten as he studied the intricate details that revealed Mark's extraordinary natural talent. The shading techniques were sophisticated, the perspective mathematically precise, and the emotional depth conveyed through simple pencil strokes was remarkable. This wasn't amateur street art. This was the work of someone with genuine artistic genius. "How much for this one?" David asked, indicating the cityscape drawing. "$5, Mark replied hopefully, then quickly added, "But I could do $3 if that's too much." His eagerness to negotiate revealed both his desperate need for money and his fear that asking too much might cost him a potential sale. David reached into his wallet, feeling the weight of a decision that seemed far more significant than a simple art purchase. He could easily afford $5. He spent more than that on his morning coffee from the executive cafe in his building. But something about the transaction felt loaded with implications he couldn't quite understand. In his wallet, David carried several $100 bills, credit cards that could purchase virtually anything he desired, and the kind of financial power that most people could only dream of possessing. Yet, as he looked at Mark's hopeful expression and the extraordinary artwork spread on damp cardboard, David felt an unexpected moment of recognition. Not of the boy, but of something he'd lost somewhere between his first startup success and his current position atop the corporate food chain. 25 years earlier, David had been a different kind of desperate. Not homeless or hungry, but trapped in a middle-class family that couldn't afford the computer programming courses he needed to pursue his passion for technology. He'd sold his baseball card collection, mowed lawns, and even resorted to selling his own crude drawings door to door to raise money for his first computer. The memory of that entrepreneurial desperation, of believing that talent and determination could overcome any obstacle, had been buried under years of board meetings and profit margins. "Actually," David said, pulling out a $20 bill, "I'd like to buy several of these. Do you have others?" Mark's eyes widened with disbelief and gratitude that was almost painful to witness. "Really? Yes, sir. I have lots more." He began carefully selecting additional drawings from his collection, his hands trembling slightly with excitement and malnutrition. David found himself genuinely engaged in examining each piece, asking questions about Mark's techniques and inspiration, while secretly marveling at the artistic sophistication hidden beneath the boy's ragged exterior. Here was raw talent that art schools would kill to develop, wasted on street corners because society had failed to provide the most basic support systems for vulnerable children. "Where do you live?" David asked, the question emerging before he could consider its implications. "Around," Mark said carefully. "I move around a lot." David understood the evasion and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Anger at systems that failed children like Mark, guilt about his own comfortable life, and something that might have been paternal protectiveness toward a boy who reminded him of his own son, whom he barely saw between business trips and board meetings. The test wasn't just Mark's artistic talent or David's financial generosity. It was a moment that challenged everything David believed about success, responsibility, and the cost of building empires while children survived on street corners just outside the gleaming towers that housed corporate America's elite. As David handed Mark the $20 bill and carefully gathered the drawings, he made a decision that would ultimately change both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. Mark stared at the $20 bill in his small hands as if it might disappear if he blinked too hard. In 6 months of selling his artwork on Seattle's unforgiving streets, he had never received more than $5 for a single transaction. And most days, he was lucky to earn enough for a single meal from the dollar menu at nearby fast food restaurants. This unexpected windfall represented more than just money. It was validation that his art had genuine value, that someone with obvious wealth and sophistication saw something worthwhile in the drawings he created with salvaged supplies and desperate hope. "Thank you so much, sir," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion that he tried to keep under control. Years of foster care had taught him that showing too much vulnerability could be dangerous, that adults often lost interest in children who seemed too needy or emotional. But David's genuine interest in his artwork and his generous purchase had created a crack in Mark's carefully constructed emotional armor. David carefully rolled the drawings and secured them with a rubber band from his briefcase, treating Mark's artwork with the same respect he might show to important contracts or financial documents. The gesture wasn't lost on the 12-year-old, who had grown accustomed to people dismissing his art as worthless scribbles or, at best, cute children's drawings worthy of a patronizing smile and spare change. "What's your name?" David asked, his corporate schedule momentarily forgotten as he found himself genuinely curious about the story behind such extraordinary talent. "Mark Scott," the boy replied, then added with the formality that suggested he'd been taught proper manners despite his current circumstances. "What's yours, sir?" "David," he replied, deliberately omitting his last name and corporate title. Something about Mark's innocence and artistic purity made David want to interact as simply a person, rather than as the CEO whose decisions affect thousands of employees and millions of dollars in quarterly profits. As David prepared to leave for his office, Mark gathered his remaining drawings with renewed energy, the $20 having transformed his morning from survival desperation into something approaching hope. But David found himself hesitating, reluctant to return to his corporate responsibilities when faced with the stark contrast between his privileged world and Mark's daily struggle for basic necessities. "Mark," David said impulsively, "would you be interested in selling your artwork somewhere besides the street, maybe somewhere warmer with more foot traffic?" The suggestion came without David fully considering its implications. He was a man accustomed to solving problems through strategic thinking and resource allocation, and seeing Mark's talent wasted on a cold street corner triggered his instinctive desire to optimize underutilized assets. But this wasn't a business problem. It was a human situation that required more than corporate solutions. Mark's expression shifted through several emotions: hope, suspicion, confusion, and finally a careful optimism that suggested he'd learned to be wary of adults bearing gifts. "Where would that be?" he asked. David's mind raced through possibilities. He owned several commercial properties, had connections with art galleries, and possessed the financial resources to create opportunities that didn't currently exist. But he also recognized the complexity of involving himself in Mark's situation. There were legal considerations, liability issues, and corporate image concerns that his board of directors would certainly raise if they learned he was personally intervening in the life of a homeless child. "Let me think about it," David said, pulling out his business card before catching himself. The card identified him as CEO of Davis Enterprises, information that would fundamentally change the dynamic between them. Instead, he pulled out a pen and wrote his personal cell phone number on a piece of paper. "If you're here tomorrow morning, I'd like to talk more about your art." Mark accepted the paper with reverence as if he'd been handed a lottery ticket. In his experience, adults who promised to return or follow up rarely did, but something about David's demeanor suggested genuine interest rather than empty platitudes. The man had already proven his sincerity by purchasing artwork at a price far above Mark's asking rate. "I'll be here," Mark promised, carefully folding the paper and placing it in his jacket pocket alongside his precious art supplies. David nodded and began walking toward the North Point Financial Tower. But after several steps, he turned back to see Mark already approaching another potential customer with renewed confidence. The boy's posture had changed subtly. His shoulders were straighter, his voice more assured as he offered his drawings to a passing tourist. The simple act of being taken seriously by one person had transformed Mark's entire demeanor. As David entered the corporate lobby with its marble floors and modern art installations worth more than most people's annual salaries, he carried Mark's drawings under his arm like precious documents. The contrast between the sterile corporate environment and the raw human creativity captured in those pencil sketches created a cognitive dissonance that followed him into the elevator. During the 47-floor ascent to his office, David found himself studying one of Mark's portraits, a detailed drawing of an elderly homeless woman that captured not just her physical features, but somehow conveyed her dignity, resilience, and the stories written in the lines around her eyes. The artistic maturity required to see and represent such emotional complexity was extraordinary in an adult artist, virtually unprecedented in a 12-year-old child. David's assistant, Jennifer, greeted him with the usual stack of urgent messages and meeting confirmations, but she noticed the rolled papers under his arm with curious glances. In 3 years of working for David, she had never seen him carry anything that wasn't directly related to corporate business. "Sir, should I reschedule your 8 a.m. with the Tokyo investors?" Jennifer asked, noting that David was 15 minutes late for his first meeting, an unprecedented deviation from his legendary punctuality. "No, I'll be right there," David replied, but he made an unusual request. "Jennifer, could you research local art programs for underprivileged youth, educational opportunities, mentorship programs, scholarships, anything that might help develop young artistic talent?" Jennifer nodded professionally, though she was clearly surprised by the request. David's charitable giving was typically handled through corporate foundations and focused on technology education and entrepreneurship programs. This was the first time he'd expressed interest in arts education or youth services. As David entered his first meeting of the day, the Tokyo investors already connected via video conference and discussing quarterly projections, he placed Mark's drawings on his desk where he could see them throughout the presentation. The juxtaposition was striking, billion-dollar corporate strategies being discussed, while the artwork of a homeless 12-year-old served as a silent reminder of the human costs hidden beneath economic abstractions. For the first time in years, David found his attention divided during a business meeting. Part of his mind engaged with profit margins and market penetration strategies, while another part contemplated the extraordinary talent he'd discovered on the street outside his building. He began to understand that his encounter with Mark represented more than a chance meeting. It was a moment that demanded action, a test of whether his success had cost him his humanity or whether he retained the capacity to see and respond to individual need in a world that rewarded emotional detachment. The defining moment wasn't just David's decision to purchase Mark's artwork or even his promise to return the next day. It was his recognition that talent and human potential were being wasted daily just outside the gleaming towers where corporate America made decisions that affect millions of lives but rarely considered the individual stories behind economic statistics. For the first time in years, David found his attention divided during a business meeting. Part of his mind engaged with profit margins and market penetration strategies, while another part contemplated the extraordinary talent he'd discovered on the street outside his building. He began to understand that his encounter with Mark represented more than a chance meeting. It was a moment that demanded action, a test of whether his success had cost him his humanity or whether he retained the capacity to see and respond to individual need in a world that rewarded emotional detachment. The defining moment wasn't just David's decision to purchase Mark's artwork or even his promise to return the next day. It was his recognition that talent and human potential were being wasted daily just outside the gleaming towers where corporate America made decisions that affect millions of lives but rarely considered the individual stories behind economic statistics. As the meeting progressed and investors discussed expansion strategies that would create jobs and generate profits, David found himself wondering about the Mark Scotts of the world, the children whose potential remained undiscovered because society's support systems had failed them before they'd had a chance to demonstrate what they might become with proper guidance and opportunity. 3 blocks away from the North Point Financial Tower, in the executive boardroom of Morrison Strategic Consulting, Sarah Chen was conducting her own morning routine with the precision of a military operation. As the founder and managing partner of Seattle's most exclusive corporate intelligence firm, Sarah specialized in what she euphemistically called strategic human asset evaluation, a sophisticated form of corporate espionage that involved identifying, researching, and sometimes recruiting individuals who possessed valuable skills or information that could benefit her high-paying clients. Sarah's company operated in the gray areas between legal business research and invasive surveillance, providing services that Fortune 500 companies needed but preferred not to acknowledge publicly. Her team of investigators, psychologists, and data analysts could compile comprehensive profiles on virtually anyone within 72 hours, using a combination of social media monitoring, financial record analysis, behavioral observation, and carefully orchestrated chance encounters that revealed personality traits and decision-making patterns. This morning, Sarah was reviewing files on potential targets for Davis Enterprises' latest acquisition strategy when her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from one of her street-level observers. The message contained a series of photographs taken with a telephoto lens showing David Davis engaged in an unusual interaction with a homeless child outside his building. Sarah studied the images with professional interest, noting David's body language, the duration of the interaction, and the obvious exchange of money for what appeared to be artwork. In 3 years of monitoring David's daily routines for various corporate intelligence purposes, she had never observed him deviating from his precise schedule or engaging with street-level individuals. This behavior represented an anomaly that demanded investigation. Rodriguez, Sarah called to her lead investigator, a former FBI agent who specialized in deep background research. I need a complete workup on a subject. 12-year-old male, currently homeless, operating as a street artist near the North Point Tower. I want to know everything: family history, foster care records, psychological profile, artistic background, current living situation, and any potential leverage points. Rodriguez nodded efficiently, accustomed to Sarah's requests for comprehensive intelligence on seemingly random individuals. Timeline? 24 hours, Sarah replied, forwarding the photographs to Rodriguez's secure tablet. And I want continuous surveillance on both the subject and Mr. Davis. Something about this suggests potential strategic value. What Sarah didn't reveal to her investigator was that David Davis himself was paying for this surveillance. 6 months earlier, Davis Enterprises had contracted Morrison Strategic Consulting to monitor David's public interactions and identify potential security threats, corporate espionage attempts, or situations that might create liability issues for the company. The contract included broad authorization to investigate anyone who established regular contact with David, ostensibly for protective purposes, but in reality providing Sarah with extensive intelligence-gathering authority. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She was now being paid to spy on David Davis's spontaneous act of kindness toward a homeless child, gathering information that could potentially be used to manipulate both individuals if the situation proved strategically valuable. Her corporate clients often benefited from her ability to identify people with exploitable talents, desperate circumstances, or emotional vulnerabilities that could be leveraged for business advantage. Within hours, Rodriguez had compiled a preliminary profile on Mark Scott that revealed a story of systemic failure and extraordinary potential. The boy's academic records showed exceptional intelligence and artistic ability, but his file also documented a heartbreaking journey through Seattle's overwhelmed foster care system. Mark's parents had died in a car accident when he was 7, leaving him with no extended family and making him a ward of the state. His foster care placements had been uniformly unsuccessful, not because Mark was difficult or problematic, but because overworked social workers had repeatedly placed him in homes that were either unsuitable or financially motivated rather than genuinely caring. 3 families had returned him to the system within months, citing his excessive focus on art as impractical and his quiet demeanor as evidence of emotional problems requiring specialized care they weren't equipped to provide. Mark had aged out of his last placement at 11, technically illegal, but occurring because his foster family had moved out of state and the system had lost track of his case during a bureaucratic transition. For 8 months, he had been surviving on the streets while officially remaining on the foster care rolls, administrative oversight that meant no one was actively looking for him or attempting to provide services. The psychological profile that Rodriguez compiled painted a picture of remarkable resilience combined with artistic genius. Mark's IQ tested in the 95th percentile. His artistic ability showed professional-level sophistication despite lack of formal training, and his behavioral patterns suggested someone who had learned to survive through intelligence and adaptability rather than aggression or manipulation. Most significantly for Sarah's purposes, Mark's circumstances made him ideal for what she privately called gratitude manipulation, the process of identifying individuals whose desperate situations made them extremely responsive to seemingly generous offers that actually serve the benefactor's strategic interests. Sarah recognized the potential immediately. David Davis had been emotionally affected by his encounter with Mark, as evidenced by his deviation from normal routine and his obvious interest in the boy's artistic talent. This emotional engagement represented a vulnerability that could be exploited if properly managed. By controlling Mark's circumstances and carefully orchestrating future interactions, Sarah could potentially influence David's decision-making in ways that served her corporate clients' interests. The strategy began forming in Sarah's mind as she reviewed Mark's file. Rather than simply monitoring the situation passively, she could actively shape it to create maximum emotional impact on David while positioning her clients to benefit from whatever opportunities emerged. If David's interest in Mark led to charitable initiatives or community outreach programs, Sarah's clients could position themselves as partners or beneficiaries. If David's involvement created positive publicity, that goodwill could be leveraged for corporate advantage. But Sarah's plan required careful timing and sophisticated manipulation. Mark needed to remain genuinely desperate enough to be grateful for David's intervention, but not so desperate that he becomes a liability or public relations problem. The boy's artistic talent needed to be showcased in ways that impressed David and potentially other influential individuals, but within contexts that Sarah's team could control and monitor. Most importantly, Sarah needed to ensure that any relationship developing between David and Mark served strategic purposes rather than simply representing David's personal charitable impulses. Corporate executives who acted from emotion rather than calculated self-interest created unpredictable variables that could interfere with carefully planned business strategies. Sarah began drafting instructions for her surveillance team, outlining a complex operation that would involve monitoring both David and Mark while gradually introducing controlled variables designed to strengthen their emotional connection and create opportunities for strategic exploitation. She would position herself as the invisible puppeteer, orchestrating a relationship that both participants believed was developing naturally. The beauty of the strategy was its deniability. If questioned, Sarah could claim she was simply providing the protective surveillance services that Davis Enterprises had contracted. Her actual manipulation of the situation would remain hidden behind layers of plausible alternative explanations and carefully constructed coincidences. As Sarah finalized her operational plan, she felt the familiar satisfaction of identifying a situation where human emotion could be converted into corporate advantage. Mark Scott's artistic talent and desperate circumstances, combined with David Davis's unexpected emotional engagement, represented raw materials that could be refined into significant strategic value for the right clients. What Sarah didn't anticipate was that some human connections might prove stronger than even the most sophisticated manipulation techniques, and that genuine talent and authentic emotion could sometimes overcome the most carefully orchestrated deception. The next morning arrived with the kind of drizzling Seattle rain that seemed to seep into everything, turning the cardboard beneath Mark's makeshift gallery into a soggy mess that threatened to dissolve completely. He had arrived at his usual spot outside the North Point Financial Tower 2 hours early, partly from excitement about David's promised return, and partly because the doorway of a nearby closed shop had offered inadequate shelter, leaving him cold and restless. Mark carefully arranged his drawings on a new piece of cardboard he'd salvaged from behind an electronics store, using a plastic shopping bag to create a minimal protection from the persistent drizzle. His art supplies were running dangerously low. The $20 from David had gone toward food and a small pack of colored pencils from the dollar store, but he still needed paper, erasers, and charcoal to maintain his artistic productivity. At exactly 7:30 a.m., David emerged from his Tesla with the punctuality that had made him legendary in Seattle's business community. But today, his usually laser-focused expression carried a distracted quality, as if part of his attention remained elsewhere. Under his arm, he carried a manila envelope and what appeared to be a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Mark," David called out, his voice carrying genuine warmth despite the professional reserve he maintained in most social interactions. "I was hoping you'd be here." Mark scrambled to his feet, nearly slipping on the wet cardboard in his eagerness to greet the man who had already exceeded every expectation he dared to form about adult reliability. "Good morning, Mr. David. I have some new drawings if you'd like to see them." David approached the display with the same careful attention he'd shown the previous day, but Mark noticed something different in his demeanor, a purposefulness that suggested their interaction had extended beyond casual interest into something more significant. "These are remarkable," David said, examining a portrait Mark had drawn of a street musician who performed near Pike Place Market. "You've captured not just his appearance, but his whole personality." "Thank you, sir," Mark replied, then added with shy pride, "I spent 3 hours watching him play yesterday. I wanted to understand what made him happy about the music so I could put that in the drawing." The comment revealed something about Mark's artistic process that impressed David even more than the technical skill evident in the drawings. The boy wasn't simply copying visual information, he was interpreting emotional content and translating it into visual form with sophistication that suggested genuine artistic genius rather than mere talent. "Mark, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," David said, his tone becoming more serious. "I'd like to propose something that might help you develop your artistic abilities while also improving your current situation." Mark's expression shifted to careful attention, the wariness of someone who had learned that adult promises often came with conditions or complications that weren't immediately obvious. "What kind of proposal?" David opened the manila envelope and pulled out several printed documents. Information about Seattle's youth arts programs, scholarship opportunities, and residential facilities that specialized in supporting gifted children who had aged out of traditional foster care systems. "I spent yesterday researching options for young artists like yourself. There are programs that could provide you with proper art training, stable housing, and educational opportunities." Mark studied the documents with the focused attention of someone who had learned to read bureaucratic language carefully, looking for the hidden requirements and restrictions that typically accompanied institutional assistance. His experience with foster care had taught him that help from adults usually came with obligations, rules, and the constant threat of having support withdrawn if he failed to meet expectations that were often unclear or contradictory. Mark pointed out the eligibility requirements that mentioned parental consent, guardian signatures, and financial contributions. "I don't have anyone like that." David had anticipated this concern during his research the previous evening. The bureaucratic barriers facing homeless youth were extensive, requiring adult advocates who could navigate complex application processes and provide financial or legal support that Mark simply didn't possess. "That's where I might be able to help," David said carefully. "I have connections with these organizations, and I could potentially serve as a sponsor or advocate to help you access these programs." The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that both participants understood but neither fully articulated. David was essentially proposing to insert himself into Mark's life as a benefactor and quasi-guardian, a role that would require ongoing financial and emotional investment. For Mark, accepting would mean trusting an adult he'd known for less than 24 hours with decisions that could fundamentally alter his future. "Why would you want to do that?" Mark asked, the question carrying both hope and suspicion. His experience had taught him that adults who offered dramatic assistance usually wanted something in return, though their expectations weren't always stated clearly at the beginning. David paused, recognizing the legitimacy of Mark's wariness while struggling to articulate motivations that he didn't fully understand himself. Because you have extraordinary talent that deserves to be developed properly. Because no 12-year-old should be living on the streets when there are alternatives available. And because he hesitated, then continued with unusual vulnerability, because I think I've forgotten what it feels like to help someone without anything in return. The honesty in David's response seemed to reassure Mark, who had developed sophisticated skills for detecting adult deception through his navigation of foster care systems and street survival. What would I have to do? David pulled out the wrapped package, revealing a professional-grade sketchbook, a set of high-quality colored pencils, and several pieces of charcoal. Mark accepted the art supplies with reverence that bordered on disbelief. The sketchbook alone was worth more than he typically earned in a week of street sales, and the colored pencils were professional-grade tools that he had only seen in art store windows during his occasional forays into warmer commercial buildings. "There's one more thing," David said, pulling out his business card, the one he had avoided showing Mark the previous day. "I should be honest about who I am. I'm the CEO of Davis Enterprises, which means I have significant financial resources and business connections. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that my offer to help isn't just good intentions. I have the actual capability to follow through." Mark studied the business card with widening eyes, recognizing the company name from news reports and building signage throughout Seattle. The revelation recontextualized everything about their interaction, transforming David from a generous stranger into one of the city's most powerful individuals. "You're really rich," Mark observed with a directness that only children could manage. "Yes," David replied simply, "but wealth doesn't automatically translate into wisdom about helping people effectively. That's why I want to proceed carefully, with your input about what kind of assistance would actually be beneficial, rather than just imposing solutions that might not fit your needs." The conversation was interrupted by David's phone buzzing with urgent messages from his assistant about a board meeting that had been moved up an hour. The demands of his corporate responsibilities reasserted themselves, creating tension between his growing commitment to Mark and the business obligations that typically consumed his entire attention. "I need to go to work," David said reluctantly, "but I'd like to continue this conversation. Would you be willing to meet somewhere more comfortable to discuss these opportunities? Maybe somewhere with better weather protection?" Mark nodded eagerly, clutching his new art supplies against his chest like precious treasures. "I'd like that very much." As David walked toward his building, he carried one of Mark's new drawings, a sketch of the Seattle skyline that the boy had completed that morning using his old worn supplies. The artwork would sit on David's desk throughout the day, serving as a tangible reminder of the commitment he was making to transform both their lives through an act of deliberate kindness that transcended typical corporate charitable giving. Neither David nor Mark noticed the discreet surveillance team documenting their interaction from strategic positions around the area, or realized that their developing relationship was being carefully monitored by professionals who specialize in converting human emotion into corporate advantage. 2 weeks later, Mark Scott stood in the lobby of the prestigious Cascade Youth Development Center, clutching his new sketchbook and wearing clothes that actually fit him properly for the first time in months. The transformation had been remarkable. David's connections had fast-tracked Mark's enrollment in the center's residential arts program, bypassing the usual 6-month waiting list and waiving the substantial fees that typically made such opportunities inaccessible to homeless youth. The Cascade Center occupied a renovated mansion in Seattle's Queen Anne district, its warm brick facade and landscaped gardens creating an atmosphere of stability and nurturing that felt almost surreal to Mark after his months of street survival. Inside, the facility hummed with creative energy. Art studios filled with natural light, music practice rooms where melodies drifted through soundproofed walls, and common areas where teenagers worked on laptops or collaborated on projects that would have been impossible to imagine from a cardboard mat outside a corporate tower. "Mark, there's someone I'd like you to meet," said Patricia Williams, the center's director, as she approached with a woman Mark didn't recognize. Patricia had become a crucial advocate in Mark's transition from street artist to residential student, helping navigate the complex paperwork and psychological evaluations required for program admission, while treating him with the respect and care that had been largely absent from his foster care experiences. The woman beside Patricia appeared to be in her 30s, professionally dressed, but with an approachable demeanor that immediately put Mark at ease. "This is Dr. Elena Rodriguez," Patricia continued. "She is a developmental psychologist who specializes in working with gifted young artists. She's going to help assess your artistic development and create a personalized curriculum." Dr. Rodriguez extended her hand with a warm smile that seemed genuine rather than professionally obligatory. "I've been looking forward to meeting you, Mark. David Davis showed me some of your street artwork, and I'm very impressed by your natural technique and emotional depth." Mark shook her hand politely, still adjusting to adult interactions that didn't involve requests for spare change or suspicion about his circumstances. "Thank you, ma'am. Mr. David said you might help me learn proper art techniques." "Actually," Dr. Rodriguez replied, "I think you might teach me a few things. Your instinctive understanding of composition and emotional expression is quite sophisticated. My role will be helping you develop technical skills to support the natural talent you already possess." The conversation took place in one of the center's art studios, surrounded by easels, professional-grade supplies, and large windows that flooded the space with the kind of natural light that Mark had only dreamed of working with during his street artist days. Other students moved through the space with the comfortable familiarity of young people who had found their creative home, their conversations a mixture of artistic terminology and typical teenage banter. What Mark didn't know was that Dr. Rodriguez's presence at the Cascade Center wasn't entirely coincidental. Sarah Chen's surveillance operation had expanded significantly, growing into a sophisticated manipulation to control every aspect of their developing relationship. Sarah had identified Dr. Rodriguez as someone who could serve dual purposes, providing legitimate artistic education for Mark while also gathering detailed psychological information that could be used to influence both Mark and David's future decisions. Dr. Rodriguez herself was unaware of the hidden agenda behind her sudden consulting opportunity at the Cascade Center. Sarah's team had approached her through intermediaries, presenting the position as a research opportunity funded by an anonymous donor interested in studying artistic development in gifted youth who had experienced trauma. The cover story was plausible enough that Dr. Rodriguez had accepted without questioning the unusual circumstances or the generous compensation that accompanied the position. "Let's start with understanding your current process," Dr. Rodriguez suggested, setting up a still life arrangement of objects, a ceramic vase, some fruit, and a piece of driftwood with interesting texture. "I'd like to see how you approach drawing from observation." Mark selected his pencils with the careful consideration of someone who had learned to make art supplies last as long as possible, though he now had access to unlimited materials through the center's well-stocked supply rooms. As he began sketching, Dr. Rodriguez observed not just his technical approach, but his body language, emotional responses, and the way he processed visual information. "You have an unusual way of seeing," Dr. Rodriguez observed as Mark's drawing took shape. "Most artists start with outlines or basic shapes, but you seem to begin with the emotional center of what you're observing." Mark paused, considering her comment. "I guess I try to understand what makes something interesting before I worry about making it look exactly right. When I was drawing people on the street, I needed to capture something that would make them want to buy the picture, so I learned to find the part of them that seemed most alive." The insight revealed something profound about Mark's artistic development that impressed Dr. Rodriguez professionally, while also providing exactly the kind of psychological information that Sarah's operation required. Mark's approach to art was fundamentally empathetic. He connected emotionally with his subjects before attempting technical representation, a quality that made his work compelling but also suggested potential vulnerability to emotional manipulation. Meanwhile, David was experiencing his own transition as his involvement with Mark began affecting other aspects of his life. His assistant Jennifer had noticed significant changes in his routine. He arrived at work later, left earlier, and frequently interrupted meetings to take calls related to Mark's care and educational arrangements. The corporate precision that had defined David's professional identity was softening as he discovered the complex logistics required to support a young person's development. "Sir, the board meeting about the quarterly projections has been postponed again," Jennifer informed him during one of his regular check-ins about Mark's progress. "They're expressing some concern about your availability for strategic planning sessions." David looked up from the latest drawing Mark had given him, a sketch of the Cascade Center's garden that somehow captured both the physical beauty of the space and the emotional sense of safety it provided. "Reschedule whatever needs to be rescheduled. This is important." The response revealed how significantly David's priorities had shifted in just 2 weeks. The man who had previously treated every business meeting as sacrosanct was now willing to delay corporate decisions to ensure Mark's successful integration into the arts program. His board of directors had begun expressing private concerns about his focus and decision-making, though none had yet directly challenged his new philanthropic interests. What neither David nor Mark realized was that their evolving relationship was being documented in extraordinary detail by Sarah's surveillance team. Every conversation was recorded, every emotional moment analyzed, and every decision tracked for potential strategic value. Sarah was building a comprehensive understanding of their psychological patterns, looking for ways to leverage their genuine affection for each other to serve her corporate clients' interests. The manipulation was subtle but pervasive. Dr. Rodriguez's assessments would be shared with Sarah's team, providing insights into Mark's emotional vulnerabilities and artistic motivations. David's changed behavior patterns at work were being monitored to identify potential business impacts that could be exploited by competitors or leveraged by strategic partners. Even Mark's artwork was being photographed and analyzed for potential commercial value or copyright opportunity. Sarah's long-term strategy involved positioning herself as the invisible facilitator of Mark and David's relationship, creating situations that would strengthen their bond while ensuring that the outcomes served her client's strategic interests. She was prepared to invest months or even years in the manipulation, understanding that the most valuable corporate intelligence often emerges from long-term relationship development rather than short-term information gathering. As Mark settled into his new life at the Cascade Center, developing friendships with other young artists and thriving under professional instruction that nurtured his natural talents, he felt a happiness and security that had been absent since his parents' death 5 years earlier. His artwork was evolving rapidly, incorporating new techniques while maintaining the emotional authenticity that had made his street art so compelling. David visited regularly, bringing encouragement and genuine interest in Mark's artistic development, while also providing the kind of adult mentorship that Mark had never experienced. Their relationship was becoming genuinely paternal, filling emotional needs that both had been unaware they possessed. Neither suspected that their authentic connection was being carefully studied and potentially manipulated by professionals who specialize in converting human emotion into corporate advantage, or that the foundation of trust they were building might ultimately be tested by revelations that could destroy everything they had created together. 6 months into Mark's residency at the Cascade Youth Development Center, his transformation had become the facility's most celebrated success story. The once homeless 12-year-old had blossomed into a confident young artist whose work was beginning to attract attention far beyond the supportive walls of the residential program. His latest series of paintings, vibrant cityscapes that captured Seattle's urban energy while conveying deep emotional narratives about community and belonging, had been selected for exhibition at the prestigious Northwest Youth Arts Festival. The invitation to exhibit came with unexpected media attention. Local news stations had picked up the story of the homeless street artist who had been discovered and mentored by a prominent CEO, creating a narrative that perfectly aligned with Seattle's progressive values and tech industry philanthropy. Mark found himself featured in newspaper articles and television interviews, his articulate explanations of his artistic process impressing audiences who expected a typical troubled youth recovery story, but instead encountered a sophisticated young artist with genuine insights about creativity and social responsibility. "Mark, you have a visitor," announced Patricia Williams, appearing at the door of the art studio where Mark was working on a large canvas depicting the view from his old street corner outside the North Point Financial Tower. The painting showed the contrast between the corporate world above and the human struggles below, but rendered with hope rather than bitterness, a mature perspective that reflected his personal journey from desperation to opportunity. David entered the studio carrying a portfolio case and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. Over the past 6 months, his relationship with Mark had evolved from charitable benefactor to something approaching a surrogate father, though neither had explicitly acknowledged the emotional depth of their connection. David's regular visits had become the highlight of both their weeks, providing Mark with consistent adult support and giving David a sense of purpose that had been missing from his corporate achievements. "I have news," David announced, setting down the portfolio case with ceremonial care. "The Seattle Art Museum wants to purchase 3 of your paintings for their permanent collection. They're also interested in commissioning a large-scale mural for their community outreach center." Mark's paintbrush clattered to the floor as he processed the magnitude of what David was telling him. The Seattle Art Museum was one of the most prestigious cultural institutions in the Pacific Northwest, and having work in their permanent collection would establish Mark as a legitimate artist rather than simply a talented youth with potential. The commission would provide financial independence and professional recognition that most artists didn't achieve until well into their careers. "Are you serious?" Mark asked, his voice catching with emotion that he couldn't quite control. "They really want to buy my paintings?" David opened the portfolio case to reveal official documents from the museum, complete with letterhead and signatures that made the offer tangible and real. "More than that, they want to offer you a full scholarship to their summer intensive program, and they're connecting you with gallery representation for future sales." The opportunities were overwhelming in their scope and life-changing potential. Mark was being offered a clear path from homeless street artist to professional recognition that would provide both financial security and creative fulfillment. Everything he had dreamed about during those cold nights on cardboard mats was suddenly within reach, facilitated by David's intervention but ultimately earned through Mark's own extraordinary talent and determination. What neither Mark nor David realized was that their celebration was being observed and recorded by Sarah Chen's surveillance team, who had positioned themselves strategically throughout the Cascade Center to document every significant moment in their relationship development. The museum's sudden interest in Mark's work wasn't entirely organic. Sarah had orchestrated the entire opportunity through carefully placed suggestions to museum board members and strategic donations that created obligations to consider young artists from underprivileged backgrounds. Sarah's manipulation had reached sophisticated levels that required coordination between multiple institutions and individuals, all unknowingly serving her larger strategy to control and leverage the relationship between Mark and David. The museum deal would create substantial emotional investment from both parties while also generating publicity that could be exploited for various corporate purposes. "There's something else," David continued, his tone becoming more serious. "The museum wants to do a documentary about your story, from street artist to collected artist. They think it could inspire other young people facing similar challenges." The documentary proposal represented another layer of Sarah's strategic planning. Film documentation would provide comprehensive material for future manipulation while also creating a public narrative that could be shaped to serve various corporate interests. The story of David's charitable intervention and Mark's artistic success would generate positive publicity that could be leveraged for business advantage while also creating emotional leverage over both participants. Mark considered the documentary proposal with the thoughtfulness that had characterized his approach to all major decisions since entering the arts program. "Would you be in it too? The documentary, I mean?" "If you're comfortable with that," David replied. "But this is your story, Mark. I'm just someone who was lucky enough to recognize your talent when I saw it." The humility in David's response reflected how genuinely their relationship had affected him. The man who had built a corporate empire through strategic thinking and calculated risk-taking had discovered aspects of himself that he hadn't known existed: protective instincts, emotional vulnerability, and a capacity for unconditional support that transcended business logic. Mark had become the son he'd never had time to properly father, while providing David with a sense of legacy that felt more meaningful than corporate achievements. Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Rodriguez entering the studio with news that would add another dimension to Mark's rising success. "Mark, I've been asked to present your case study at the National Conference on Gifted Youth Development. Your artistic progression and psychological resilience are remarkable to contribute significantly to research about supporting talented children who have experienced trauma." The academic recognition represented validation from yet another prestigious institution, further establishing Mark's transformation as an exceptional success story worthy of national attention. But it also meant that Mark's personal journey would be analyzed and discussed by professionals who might identify patterns or vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those with strategic interests in understanding his psychological makeup. Mark felt overwhelmed by the sudden convergence of opportunities that seemed almost too good to be true. The museum purchases, the scholarship, the gallery representation, the documentary, and now academic recognition. Everything was happening simultaneously in ways that felt miraculous, but also created pressure to live up to expectations that kept expanding beyond his ability to fully comprehend. "It's a lot," Mark admitted, looking around the studio that had become his creative sanctuary. "Sometimes I worry that I'll disappoint everyone who's invested in helping me." David placed a reassuring hand on Mark's shoulder, recognizing the anxiety that accompanied rapid success and sudden visibility. "You've already exceeded everyone's expectations, including your own. Everything else is just opportunity. You don't owe anyone particular outcomes." But even as David offered reassurance, he felt his own anxiety about the increasing public attention surrounding Mark's story. As a businessman, he understood how media narratives could be shaped and manipulated for various purposes, and he worried about Mark's privacy and emotional well-being as their relationship became subject to public scrutiny and interpretation. Neither David nor Mark understood that their concerns were well-founded, though not for the reasons they imagined. The success story that was bringing Mark recognition and opportunities was being carefully orchestrated by professionals who specialized in creating situations that appeared beneficial while serving hidden strategic purposes. As Mark signed the museum contracts and agreed to participate in the documentary, he was unknowingly entering a more complex phase of manipulation that would test both his artistic integrity and his relationship with David in ways that neither could anticipate. The foundation of trust they had built was about to be challenged by revelations that would force them to distinguish between authentic support and strategic exploitation. The art studio where they celebrated Mark's success was filled with natural light and creative possibility, but outside that protective environment, forces were already in motion that would soon transform their inspiring story into something far more complicated and potentially devastating than either could imagine. The documentary filming began 3 months later with a production crew that brought an unexpected level of sophistication to what Mark had imagined would be a simple interview about his artistic journey. The producer, Michael Thompson, arrived with camera operators, sound technicians, and lighting specialists who transformed the Cascade Center's art studio into a professional film set. Mark found himself wearing makeup for the first time in his life, while technicians adjusted elaborate equipment that seemed disproportionate to his story's importance. "We're calling it Canvas of Hope, From Streets to Success," Michael explained as his crew made final preparations. "Your story represents something powerful about American opportunity and the difference that mentorship can make in a young person's life. We're planning to submit it to several film festivals and potentially distribute it through educational channels." Mark nodded politely, though he felt increasingly uncomfortable with the grand narrative being constructed around his experiences. The questions focused heavily on the most dramatic aspects of his homelessness, the hunger, the cold nights, the fear, rather than the artistic development and personal growth that felt more significant to him. They seemed determined to emphasize his victimhood to make David's intervention appear more heroic, creating a simplified story that didn't reflect the complexity of either his circumstances or their relationship. David arrived for his scheduled interview segment wearing the kind of polished corporate attire that marked him as a successful executive, though Mark noticed he seemed uncharacteristically nervous about the filming process. Their friendship had developed in private settings where David's wealth and status were background factors rather than defining characteristics, but the documentary format inevitably emphasized the dramatic contrast between their social positions. "Mr. Davis, what motivated you to help Mark when you first encountered him?" Michael asked, positioning the question to elicit the kind of inspirational response that would resonate with audiences seeking uplifting content. David paused, clearly struggling to articulate motivations that felt deeply personal rather than publicly explainable. "I saw extraordinary talent being wasted because circumstances had prevented Mark from accessing opportunities that most children take for granted. It seemed wrong to walk past that situation without trying to help." The response was honest, but understated, failing to capture the emotional complexity that had driven David's initial decision and sustained his ongoing commitment to Mark's development. The camera's presence seemed to create distance between them, transforming their natural interaction into something more formal and less authentic. Mark's own interview segments proved equally challenging as he tried to explain his artistic process and personal journey, while camera operators adjusting angles and producers prompting him to repeat responses with more emotional intensity. The crew's focus on his homeless period made him feel like his current success was less interesting than his previous suffering, as if his value as a documentary subject depended on maintaining victim status rather than celebrating his artistic achievements. "Tell us about the moment you realized your life was changing," Michael prompted, clearly hoping for a dramatic revelation that would provide the documentary's emotional climax. Mark considered the question carefully, recognizing that the honest answer was more gradual and complex than the narrative structure seemed to require. "It wasn't really one moment," he said slowly. "It was more like realizing that someone believed in my art enough to help me develop it properly. The change happened over time as I learned to trust that the opportunities were real." The response disappointed the production team, who had hoped for a more cinematically satisfying transformation moment. They spent additional time filming reaction shots and requesting alternative versions of Mark's responses, trying to construct a more dramatically coherent narrative from the raw material of his actual experience. What neither Mark nor David realized was that the documentary production itself was another component of Sarah Chen's expanding manipulation. Michael Thompson's production company had been selected and partially funded through a network of shell corporations and strategic partnerships that ultimately traced back to Sarah's corporate intelligence operation. The film would serve multiple purposes, creating public relations value for Davis Enterprises, generating psychological profiles of both Mark and David, and establishing a documented narrative that could be leveraged for future strategic advantage. The filming process also introduced new relationships that would prove significant to Sarah's long-term plans. Dr. Rodriguez had been invited to participate as an expert commentator on Mark's psychological resilience and artistic development, providing her with additional opportunities to gather detailed information about Mark's emotional patterns and decision-making processes. Her academic analysis would become part of the documentary's educational value while also feeding into Sarah's comprehensive psychological assessment. During a break in filming, Mark and David found themselves alone in the center's garden, away from the cameras and production crew. The natural setting allowed them to reconnect without the artificial constraints of media documentation, though both felt the lingering effects of having their relationship scrutinized and interpreted by outside observers. "This feels different from what I expected," Mark admitted, sitting on a bench where he often came to sketch when he needed quiet time away from the center's structured activities. "They keep asking about being homeless, like that's the most important thing about me." David understood Mark's discomfort, recognizing that the documentary format was reducing their complex relationship to a simplified narrative about charity and gratitude. "Your homelessness was a circumstance, not your identity. Your talent and character are what make you remarkable, not your previous difficulties." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Rodriguez approaching with news that would add another layer of complexity to Mark's rapidly expanding public profile. "Mark, I've received a call from the National Endowment for the Arts. They're interested in featuring your work in a traveling exhibition about youth resilience and artistic expression. It would tour major cities across the country for 2 years." The opportunity represented national recognition that would establish Mark as one of the most prominent young artists in America, providing platform and visibility that could launch a significant professional career. But it also meant continued public attention and media scrutiny that would make privacy and normal teenage development increasingly difficult to maintain. There's also interest from several universities in offering you early admission to their arts programs, Dr. Rodriguez continued. Your story and talent have attracted attention from academic institutions that typically don't consider applicants under 16. Mark felt the weight of decisions that seemed to expand faster than his ability to process their implications. Each opportunity was individually exciting and potentially life-changing, but collectively they were creating pressure and expectations that felt overwhelming for someone who had recently been focused on basic survival needs. David sensed Mark's anxiety and recognized the importance of protecting the boy's emotional well-being as his public profile expanded. "Mark doesn't have to decide everything right now," he said firmly. "These opportunities will still exist after he's had time to consider what he actually wants rather than what other people think he should want." The protective instinct in David's response reflected how deeply parental his feelings toward Mark had become, though neither had explicitly acknowledged the family-like dynamic that had developed between them. David was beginning to understand that his role had evolved beyond charitable benefactor to something approaching guardianship, with all the emotional investment and protective responsibility that such a relationship entailed. As the documentary filming concluded and the production crew packed their equipment, Mark and David walked back to the art studio, where Mark's latest paintings were displayed with museum-quality lighting that emphasized their professional caliber. The artwork represented not just Mark's artistic development, but also the transformation that both of them had experienced through their unlikely friendship. "Whatever happens with all these opportunities," David said, "I want you to know that I'm proud of who you've become, not just what you've achieved." The distinction was important to both of them, acknowledging that their relationship had value beyond the public success story that was attracting so much attention. They had created something authentic and meaningful that transcended the dramatic narrative being constructed around their circumstances. Neither suspected that their private moment of connection was being observed and recorded by surveillance equipment that had been discreetly installed during the documentary filming, or that their most personal conversations were being analyzed by professionals who specialize in identifying emotional vulnerabilities that could be exploited for strategic advantage. The discovery came by accident on a Tuesday morning when Mark arrived early at the Cascade Center's computer lab to research art techniques for his upcoming museum commission. The lab was empty except for the custodial staff, and Mark had settled into his usual workstation when he noticed something unusual: a USB drive that had been left plugged into the computer terminal next to his usual spot. The device appeared to have been forgotten by the previous user, its small LED light blinking to indicate active file transfer. Mark's first instinct was to notify the center's staff about the lost device, but as he reached to unplug it, the computer screen automatically opened a folder containing hundreds of video files, audio recordings, and detailed documents that made his blood run cold. The folder was labeled Scott Mark Surveillance Project and contained what appeared to be comprehensive documentation of every aspect of his life since arriving at the Cascade Center. With trembling hands, Mark clicked on the first video file and watched security footage of himself having lunch with other students, the camera angle suggesting hidden recording equipment that had captured private conversations he'd never known were being monitored. Another file contained audio recordings of his phone conversations with David, including deeply personal discussions about his fears, dreams, and growing attachment to the man who had become his surrogate father. The most devastating discovery was a series of detailed psychological profiles that analyzed his emotional patterns, artistic motivations, and relationship dependencies with clinical precision. The documents described him as highly responsive to perceived abandonment threats and demonstrating exploitable gratitude patterns toward benefactor figure. The language was coldly professional, reducing his genuine emotions and relationships to strategic data points in what appeared to be an extensive intelligence operation. Mark's hands shook as he opened a file labeled Operation Summary that revealed the scope of what had been done to him. The document outlined a comprehensive manipulation strategy designed to control his relationship with David while gathering information that could be used for unspecified corporate purposes. Every opportunity that had seemed like miraculous good fortune, the museum interest, the documentary, the national recognition, had been carefully orchestrated by a company called Morrison Strategic Consulting. The file contained photographs of Mark taken with telephoto lenses during his homeless period, showing that the surveillance had begun weeks before his first encounter with David. There were detailed analyses of his daily routines, psychological vulnerabilities, and artistic development, all compiled by investigators who had been studying him like a laboratory specimen, while he believed he was simply trying to survive on Seattle's streets. Most shocking was the revelation that David's initial encounter with Mark had not been the spontaneous act of kindness that had formed the foundation of their relationship. According to the documents, Morrison Strategic Consulting had identified David as a target for a different corporate intelligence operation, and Mark's presence outside the North Point Financial Tower had been positioned to create exactly the kind of emotional engagement that had occurred. The files showed that Sarah Chen, identified as Morrison's founder and managing partner, had been paid by an unnamed client to monitor David's activities and identify potential leverage points for corporate manipulation. Mark's desperate circumstances and extraordinary artistic talent had made him ideal for what the documents called emotional asset development, using his genuine need and gratitude to create psychological influence over David that could be exploited for business advantage. Mark sat frozen in front of the computer screen, his mind struggling to process the implications of what he was reading. Every relationship he had formed, every opportunity he had received, every moment of happiness and security he had experienced over the past 10 months had been built on a foundation of deception and manipulation. The adults he had learned to trust had been studying him, recording him, and using his emotional responses for purposes he still didn't fully understand. The psychological profiles revealed intimate details about his thought processes, fears, and attachment patterns that he had never consciously shared with anyone. The investigators had somehow gained access to his therapy sessions with Dr. Rodriguez, his private conversations with other students, and even his artistic process, analyzing his drawings and paintings for insights into his emotional state and psychological development. A file labeled Future Strategic Options outlined potential ways that his relationship with David could be leveraged for corporate benefit, including scenarios where Mark's public profile could be used to influence David's business decisions or where their documented friendship could be exploited to create favorable publicity for various corporate initiatives. The document discussed Mark's optimal emotional dependency levels and recommended strategies for maintaining his gratitude while preventing him from developing too much independence or critical thinking about his circumstances. Mark's initial shock gave way to a nauseating realization about the extent of his violation. Not only had his privacy been completely destroyed, but his most precious relationships had been artificially constructed and manipulated by people who viewed him as nothing more than a useful tool for corporate espionage. The love and trust he had developed for David, the sense of family and belonging he had found at the Cascade Center, the pride he had taken in his artistic achievements, all of it had been contaminated by strategic calculation and professional manipulation. The documents also revealed uncomfortable truths about institutions he had trusted. Dr. Rodriguez's psychological assessments had been shared with Morrison Strategic Consulting, apparently without her knowledge, but through data breaches that suggested sophisticated corporate espionage capabilities. The Cascade Center staff had been monitored and their interactions with Mark analyzed for strategic intelligence, though most appeared to be unknowing participants in the surveillance operation. Even more disturbing was evidence that his artwork had been photographed and analyzed not just for its artistic merit, but for potential commercial exploitation. The files contained market analyses of his painting's sales potential, copyright assessments, and strategic recommendations for controlling his artistic output to maximize corporate benefit. His creativity had been reduced to economic projections and intellectual property considerations by people who had never cared about his artistic development or personal well-being. Mark printed the most damaging documents with mechanical precision, his artistic hands moving automatically while his mind struggling to comprehend the full scope of the betrayal. The evidence filled nearly 50 pages of psychological profiles, surveillance reports, and strategic analyses that documented every aspect of his manipulated life. As the printer worked, he noticed his hands were shaking, with a mixture of rage, grief, and terror about confronting the adults who had orchestrated this elaborate deception. The question that tormented him most was David's role in the conspiracy. The surveillance files suggested that David himself was a target of corporate intelligence gathering rather than a co-conspirator, but Mark couldn't be certain whether the man he had come to love as a father was genuinely caring or simply playing a more sophisticated role in the manipulation. The psychological profiles indicated that David's emotional attachment to Mark was authentic, but they also showed how that attachment was being strategically exploited by Sarah Chen's operation. Mark gathered the printed documents and USB drive, evidence of a violation so comprehensive that it challenged his ability to trust his own perceptions and relationships. Every conversation he had valued, every moment of connection he had treasured, every achievement he had celebrated was now suspect, potentially tainted by the knowledge that hidden observers had been analyzing and manipulating his responses for corporate advantage. As other students began arriving for their morning computer lab sessions, Mark slipped out of the center with evidence that would force him to confront the most important relationship in his life while questioning everything he believed about trust, authenticity, and the possibility of genuine human connection in a world where even the most vulnerable could be reduced to strategic assets in corporate intelligence operations. The walk to David's office would be the longest of his young life, carrying proof that would either destroy their relationship or forge it stronger through the shared recognition of how completely they had both been manipulated by professionals who specialized in converting human emotion into business advantage. Mark stood outside the North Point Financial Tower, clutching the printed surveillance documents against his chest, his heart pounding with an intensity that made him feel dizzy. The imposing glass structure that had once represented hope and opportunity now felt like a monument to deception and manipulation. Security guards in the lobby recognized him from his regular visits and waved him through with friendly smiles that now seemed potentially complicit in the elaborate surveillance operation that had controlled his life for nearly a year. The elevator ride to the 47th floor felt interminable, each floor marking his ascent toward a confrontation that would either destroy the most important relationship in his life or reveal whether genuine connection could survive the discovery of its manipulated origins. Mark had rehearsed various approaches during his sleepless night, but none seemed adequate for communicating the magnitude of betrayal he had uncovered while preserving the possibility that David himself was a victim rather than a perpetrator. Jennifer, David's assistant, greeted Mark with her usual warmth, though she noticed his pale complexion and the manila folder he clutched with white-knuckled intensity. "Mark, David's in his morning meeting with the board, but I can let him know you're here if it's urgent." "It's urgent," Mark replied, his voice carrying a gravity that immediately concerned Jennifer. She had watched Mark's transformation from nervous street artist to confident young man over the past months, but today he seemed fragile in a way that reminded her of his earliest visits when trauma and mistrust had shaped every interaction. Within minutes, David emerged from the boardroom, cutting short his meeting when Jennifer conveyed Mark's distress. His immediate response to prioritize Mark over corporate obligations had become characteristic of how completely his relationship with the boy had altered his professional priorities, though today that protectiveness would be tested in ways he couldn't have anticipated. "Mark, what's wrong?" David asked, his concern evident as he ushered the boy into his private office and closed the door. The space was familiar territory for both of them, the place where they had planned Mark's future, celebrated his achievements, and developed the father-son dynamic that had become central to both their emotional lives. Mark placed the manila folder on David's desk with trembling hands, then stepped back, as if the documents were contaminated with something dangerous. David opened the folder and began reading with the same focused attention he brought to critical business documents, but his expression gradually shifted from confusion to horror as he processed the scope of what Mark had discovered. The surveillance reports, psychological profiles, and strategic analyses painted a picture of manipulation so comprehensive that it challenged everything he believed about their relationship and the circumstances that had brought them together. "Mark, I had no idea," David said quietly, his voice heavy with the shock of learning that his most meaningful personal relationship had been orchestrated and monitored by corporate intelligence professionals. Mark searched David's face for signs of deception, using skills he had developed during his foster care experiences to detect adult dishonesty. What he saw was genuine devastation, the expression of someone whose trust had been violated as completely as his own. David's reaction seemed authentic, but Mark's ability to distinguish between real and performed emotion had been shattered by the discovery that trained professionals had been studying and manipulating his responses for months. "How do I know what's real?" Mark asked, the question emerging as both accusation and plea. "How do I know if you actually care about me, or if you're just better at hiding the manipulation than the others?" David set down the documents and looked directly at Mark, recognizing that this moment would determine whether their relationship could survive the revelation of its corrupted foundation. "Because I'm asking myself the same question," he replied honestly. "Because I'm wondering whether my feelings for you were genuine or whether I was somehow programmed to respond to you in exactly the way these people wanted." The mutual vulnerability in David's response seemed to reassure Mark more than defensive protests might have. They were both victims of the same sophisticated manipulation, both struggling to distinguish between authentic emotions and strategically induced responses. The shared uncertainty created a foundation for rebuilding trust rather than destroying it entirely. "Look at this," Mark said, pulling out the most damaging document, the psychological profile that described him as demonstrating exploitable gratitude patterns and recommended strategies for maintaining his emotional dependency. "They've been studying how my brain works so they could use my feelings against both of us." David read the clinical analysis of Mark's emotional patterns with growing anger, recognizing the violation represented by reducing a child's natural responses to strategic data points. "This is monstrous," he said quietly, "using a child's trauma and trust as tools for corporate manipulation." They spent the next hour reviewing the surveillance documents together, piecing together the scope of Sarah Chen's operation and its implications for everyone they had trusted. Dr. Rodriguez appeared to be an unwitting participant whose legitimate research had been compromised by data theft. The Cascade Center staff seemed genuinely caring, but had been monitored without their knowledge. Even the museum's interest in Mark's work had been artificially stimulated through strategic donations and influence campaigns. The documentary, Mark realized with fresh horror. They filmed us being honest about our relationship so they could study how we interact when we think we're being authentic. David nodded grimly, understanding that their most private moments had been performed for hidden audiences who were analyzing their emotional responses for strategic advantage. The violation felt more intimate than financial theft or corporate espionage. It was the weaponization of human connection itself. "What do we do now?" Mark asked, the question carrying weight beyond the immediate crisis. Their relationship had been built on a foundation that proved to be artificially constructed, but the emotions they had developed felt genuine despite their manipulated origins. David considered the question carefully, recognizing that his response would shape not only their future relationship, but Mark's ability to trust adults and institutions for the rest of his life. "We decide what parts of our relationship belong to us rather than to them," he said finally. We figure out which feelings were real and build from there. The approach acknowledged the complexity of their situation without dismissing the genuine care they had developed for each other. Both had been manipulated, but both had also chosen to invest emotionally in their relationship beyond what any external force could compel. Their task was distinguishing between induced responses and authentic connection while preserving what was valuable despite its corrupted origins. "I want to confront them," Mark said, his artistic sensitivity transformed into fierce anger at the violation of his privacy and autonomy. "I want to make them explain why they thought they had the right to treat me like a laboratory experiment." David understood Mark's need for confrontation and accountability, but he also recognized the dangers of challenging sophisticated corporate intelligence operations without proper preparation and legal support. "We'll confront them," he promised, "but we'll do it strategically, with evidence and legal representation that can actually hold them accountable rather than just expressing our anger." The conversation was interrupted by Jennifer's voice over the intercom, announcing that Sarah Chen was in the lobby requesting an immediate meeting with David about urgent matters requiring discretion. The timing was clearly not coincidental. Sarah's surveillance operation would have detected Mark's discovery of the files and his subsequent visit to David's office. Mark and David looked at each other with recognition that their confrontation would come sooner than expected, that the woman who had orchestrated their manipulation was already moving to control the narrative and minimize the damage to her operation. "Are you ready for this?" David asked, his protective instincts warring with respect for Mark's right to face his tormentors directly. Mark squared his shoulders with determination that drew on reserves of strength he had developed during his months of street survival. "I've been ready my whole life," he replied, preparing to confront the woman who had reduced his humanity to strategic data points and corporate intelligence reports. Sarah Chen entered David's office with the calculated confidence of someone accustomed to controlling difficult situations through strategic information and psychological leverage. She carried herself with the professional poise that had made her one of Seattle's most sought-after corporate intelligence specialists, but Mark noticed subtle signs of tension in her posture that suggested she was less certain about this encounter than her demeanor implied. "Mr. Davis, Mark," Sarah began, her voice maintaining professional neutrality despite the explosive circumstances that had brought them together. Mark felt his anger intensified at Sarah's euphemistic language, referring to comprehensive surveillance and psychological manipulation as concerning information, and treating their violation as a business problem requiring negotiation rather than a fundamental breach of human dignity. The clinical detachment in her approach reminded him of the cold psychological profiles that had reduced his emotions and relationships to strategic data points. "Context?" Mark said, his voice carrying fury that surprised even himself with its intensity. "You want to provide context for spying on a homeless 12-year-old and using his trauma to manipulate a corporate executive? What context could possibly justify treating a child like a laboratory rat in your corporate espionage experiment?" Sarah remained composed, a response that seemed rehearsed rather than natural. "Mark, I understand your distress, but the situation is more complex than the documentation might suggest. My company was hired to provide protective surveillance for Mr. Davis, and your involvement was assessed as a potential security concern that required evaluation." David slammed his hand on the desk with uncharacteristic violence, his corporate restraint finally cracking under the weight of Sarah's calculated justifications. "Security concern? You documented every conversation we had, analyzed Mark's psychological patterns, and orchestrated opportunities to strengthen our emotional connection. That's not security assessment, that's manipulation on a scale that belongs in a psychological thriller, not a business relationship." Sarah's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing frustration at their refusal to accept her reframing of the situation. "Mr. Davis, you contracted my services to monitor potential threats to your personal and corporate interests. A homeless child with artistic talent who triggered your charitable instincts represented exactly the kind of vulnerability that required assessment and management. Management? Mark interrupted, the word hitting him like a physical blow. You managed my homelessness, my art, my relationships, my entire life like I was some kind of corporate asset you could manipulate for profit? Sarah turned to address Mark directly, her tone shifting to something that might have been intended as maternal but felt patronizing and false. Mark, everything that happened to you was beneficial. You received housing, education, artistic development, and opportunities that transformed your life from desperate survival to promising success. The methods may seem intrusive in retrospect, but the outcomes were entirely positive. The argument revealed Sarah's fundamental misunderstanding of the ethical violations involved in her operation. She seemed genuinely unable to comprehend that positive outcomes didn't justify manipulative methods, that Mark's consent and autonomy mattered, regardless of how much her intervention had improved his circumstances. "You stole my choices," Mark replied with clarity that surprised the adults in the room. "Maybe the outcomes were good, but I never got to choose them freely because you were controlling information and manipulating situations to push me in directions you wanted me to go. You took away my right to make real decisions about my own life." David felt fierce pride in Mark's articulation of the core ethical issue, recognizing that the boy's insight cut to the heart of what made Sarah's actions unforgivable regardless of their beneficial results. Mark had identified the fundamental violation, not just of privacy, but of human agency and autonomous decision-making. Sarah's composure finally cracked as she realized that neither Mark nor David would accept her utilitarian justification for the surveillance operation. "Fine," she said, her professional mask dissolving to reveal calculating hostility underneath. "But before you decide to pursue legal action or public exposure, you should understand what that would cost both of you." The shift to implicit threats confirmed what Mark and David had suspected, that Sarah's willingness to manipulate their relationship extended to her readiness to damage them if they refused to cover up her violations. Mark's artistic success, his museum representation, his national recognition, all of it was facilitated through my network of contacts and strategic influence, Sarah continued, her tone becoming openly menacing. If you choose to make this surveillance operation public, those same networks can ensure that Mark's reputation is destroyed and his opportunities disappear. David stood up, his full height and corporate authority finally asserting himself against Sarah's psychological manipulation tactics. "Are you threatening a child's future because he discovered that you were violating his privacy and exploiting his vulnerability?" "I'm explaining the practical consequences of different choices," Sarah replied with cold precision. "Mark's story is compelling as an inspiration narrative about charitable intervention and artistic triumph. But it becomes much less appealing if it's revealed as the result of corporate manipulation and surveillance. The media attention that has benefited Mark could easily be turned against him." Mark felt the familiar helplessness that had characterized his foster care experiences, the recognition that adults with power could destroy his life through systems he didn't understand or control. But his months of stability and David's support had also built confidence that allowed him to respond differently than he might have as a desperate street artist. "Let them destroy my reputation," Mark said quietly, his voice carrying steel that surprised even himself. "I'd rather have nothing than have things that were built on lies and manipulation. My art was real before you started managing my life, and it'll be real after everyone forgets about your fake success story." The response revealed how thoroughly Mark had internalized the values that David had tried to model, choosing integrity over advantage, authenticity over manipulation, even when the personal cost was significant. Sarah seemed genuinely surprised by Mark's rejection of her leverage, having miscalculated his attachment to the success that her manipulation had facilitated. Her psychological profiles had suggested that Mark's gratitude and fear of returning to homelessness would make him reluctant to jeopardize the stability he had achieved, but she had underestimated his capacity for moral courage. "Mr. Davis," Sarah said, turning her attention to what she perceived as the more pragmatic target, Your involvement in this situation could create significant corporate liability if mishandled. Your board of directors might question decisions that prioritized personal charity over fiduciary responsibility, especially if those decisions were influenced by sophisticated manipulation that you failed to detect. David recognized the corporate threat implicit in Sarah's words, the suggestion that his relationship with Mark could be used to challenge his leadership effectiveness and decision-making capacity. Board members who were already concerned about his changing priorities could use evidence of manipulation to question his judgment and potentially force leadership changes. "My board can question whatever they want," David replied with conviction that surprised him. "My relationship with Mark is the most meaningful thing I've accomplished in 10 years of corporate success. If they want to destroy that because it makes them uncomfortable about their own moral failures, they're welcome to try." The unified front that Mark and David presented against Sarah's threats seemed to frustrate her strategic calculations. Both were willing to sacrifice material benefits to preserve their integrity and autonomy, making them poor targets for the leverage-based manipulation that had built her corporate intelligence empire. Sarah gathered her materials with professional efficiency, recognizing that her attempt to control the situation through negotiation and threats had failed. "You're making a mistake," she said as she prepared to leave, "but it's your mistake to make." As the door closed behind Sarah, Mark and David found themselves alone with the weight of decisions that would determine not only their individual futures, but the possibility of authentic relationships in a world where even the most vulnerable could be reduced to strategic assets in corporate intelligence operations. 2 years later, Mark stood in front of his latest painting in the community art center that had become his second home, a vibrant mural depicting children from diverse backgrounds creating art together, their faces illuminated with the joy of authentic creative expression. The painting was part of his ongoing series about authentic versus manufactured experiences, artwork that had emerged from his personal journey through manipulation and recovery into something deeper and more meaningful than his earlier street art or even his museum pieces. The community center occupied a converted warehouse in Seattle's International District, far from the gleaming corporate towers where his story had begun. Mark had chosen this location deliberately after the legal settlement with Morrison Strategic Consulting had provided him with financial resources to establish his own artistic space, somewhere that prioritized genuine community connection over strategic networking or corporate partnerships. "Mark, the reporter from the Seattle Times, is here for the interview," announced Lisa Park, the center's director and one of the few adults Mark had learned to trust completely since the surveillance revelation. Lisa had been hired specifically because her background in social work and community organizing included no connections to corporate intelligence or strategic consulting firms, a prerequisite that Mark had insisted upon after learning how thoroughly his previous support network had been compromised. The reporter, James Wilson, approached with the respectful demeanor of someone who understood that Mark's story represented more than just another inspirational narrative about overcoming adversity. The legal case against Morrison Strategic Consulting had generated significant media attention, transforming Mark from a feel-good success story into a symbol of resistance against corporate manipulation of vulnerable populations. "Mark, your lawsuit against Morrison Strategic Consulting resulted in the largest settlement ever awarded in a corporate surveillance case involving a minor. But you've donated most of that money to establish this community center rather than using it for personal benefit. What motivated that decision?" Mark considered the question while mixing paint for his afternoon art class, a group of homeless teenagers who had found their way to the center through word-of-mouth networks rather than institutional referrals. His approach to helping others had been shaped by his own experience of manipulation, emphasizing genuine choice and authentic relationship building over strategic intervention or paternalistic charity. The community center operated on principles that directly contradicted the corporate charity model that had initially shaped Mark's experiences. Rather than imposing predetermined programs or strategic objectives, the center provided resources and space for young people to develop their own creative projects and support networks. Mark's role was more facilitator than director, helping others access opportunities without controlling their choices or analyzing their responses for strategic advantage. Your relationship with David Davis has also evolved significantly since the surveillance revelation, James continued. Can you talk about how you've rebuilt trust after learning that your initial connection was artificially orchestrated? Mark smiled at the mention of David, their relationship having survived the manipulation crisis and emerged stronger through the shared commitment to authenticity over convenience. David still visits regularly, but their interactions had been restructured around genuine choice rather than strategic charity. David provided financial support for the center without expecting control over its operations, and their personal relationship had developed into something genuinely familial despite its corrupted origins. We decided that the manipulation didn't erase the real feelings we developed for each other, Mark explained. But we also had to learn how to relate without the artificial gratitude and dependency that the surveillance was designed to create. It took time to figure out what belonged to us versus what belonged to Sarah Chen's psychological manipulation. The process of rebuilding their relationship required extensive therapy and careful renegotiation of boundaries that respected both Mark's autonomy and David's genuine paternal feelings. They had learned to distinguish between authentic care and strategic intervention, developing a connection based on mutual respect rather than charity and gratitude dynamics that could be exploited by outside observers. David arrived at the center as the interview was concluding, carrying his usual offering, art supplies requested by specific students rather than general donations that might feel paternalistic or strategic. His role had evolved from benefactor to something more like an uncle or family friend, someone who provides support without expecting particular outcomes or responses. Mark's work here has taught me more about authentic community engagement than 20 years of corporate philanthropy, David told the reporter. Real help means providing resources and stepping back, not managing outcomes or monitoring responses for strategic advantage. The comment reflected how significantly David's perspective on charitable giving had changed since the surveillance revelation. His corporate foundation now operated on principles of community self-determination rather than strategic intervention, providing funding without the oversight and control mechanisms that had characterized his previous charitable activities. After the reporter left, Mark and David walked through the center's various studios, where young artists worked on projects that reflected their own interests and experiences, rather than curricula designed by adult educators. The atmosphere was chaotic but authentic, filled with the kind of creative energy that emerged when people felt genuinely free to express themselves without strategic considerations or manipulative oversight. Sarah Chen's firm was shut down last month, David mentioned, as they observed a group of teenagers collaborating on a sculpture made from recycled materials. The legal precedent from your case made their business model too risky for corporate clients. Mark felt satisfaction at the news, though it was tempered by recognition that other firms would likely develop more sophisticated methods for converting human vulnerability into corporate advantage. The surveillance techniques that had been used against him were symptoms of larger systemic problems, rather than isolated incidents that could be resolved through individual legal action. "At least other kids won't have to go through what I did," Mark replied. "Maybe that's enough." But Mark's real legacy wasn't the legal precedent or the monetary settlement. It was the community center that demonstrated alternatives to strategic charity and manipulative intervention. Young people who came to the center learned not just artistic techniques, but also critical thinking skills about distinguishing between authentic support and strategic manipulation. They developed the kind of emotional intelligence that could recognize and resist the psychological leverage techniques that had been used against Mark. That evening, as Mark finished teaching his art class and prepared to close the center, he reflected on how completely his life had transformed since those desperate mornings on cardboard mats outside corporate towers. The homeless street artist selling drawings for survival had evolved into a young man who understood that authentic human connection required vigilance against forces that sought to exploit vulnerability for strategic advantage. His latest self-portrait, hanging near the center's entrance, showed not just his artistic development, but his emotional growth through trauma and recovery. The painting captured someone who had learned to trust carefully, love authentically, and help others without repeating the manipulative patterns that had once defined his own rescue. Mark Scott had discovered that genuine hope required not just individual success, but collective resistance to systems that reduce human relationships to strategic assets. His story had begun with $1 exchanged for a drawing, but it had evolved into something much more significant. Proof that authentic connection could survive even the most sophisticated manipulation if people were willing to choose truth over convenience, integrity over advantage, and genuine care over strategic intervention. The community center's lights stayed on late into the evening, illuminated by young artists who had found space to create freely, supported by adults who had learned to help without controlling, building relationships based on mutual respect rather than strategic advantage. In a world where even the most vulnerable could be reduced to data points in corporate intelligence operations, they had created something genuinely authentic. A place where human connection could flourish without hidden agendas or manipulative oversight. Mark's journey from desperate street artist to community leader had proven that resilience could transform trauma into wisdom, that authentic relationships could emerge from corrupted foundations, and that the most powerful response to systematic manipulation was the creation of genuine alternatives based on trust, choice, and authentic human connection. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.